C.S. Lewis once wrote, "Hardships often prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny. If there is such a thing as a final test from God, it will not be a test of words, but of the heart. It will not ask what we have memorized, but what we have become." Many believe trials are punishments, but what if they are preparations? When gold is tested, it is not to destroy it, but to purify it. The fire does not weaken the gold, it reveals its true strength. In the same way, God's tests are not to break us, but to shape us into something unshakable. What makes the final test so difficult is not the suffering itself, but the silence of God in the midst of it. When the teacher is silent, the test is in progress. In those moments, doubt creeps in. Has God abandoned me? Does he even hear me? But faith is not proven in comfort, it is proven in the furnace, where everything around us tells us to give up, yet something within us chooses to hold on. We often pray for an escape, but God is looking for endurance. The final test is not about survival, it is about transformation. The pain is not the end, it is the process. When the test is over, we will see that God was never absent. He was shaping us into what he always knew we could be. The question is not, will you pass, but rather, will you trust? Because in the end, God is not looking for perfect answers. He is looking for a faithful heart. And that, my friends, is the final test. C.S. Lewis once wrote in The Problem of Pain, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." If we could truly grasp the purpose of trials, we would not fear them as punishments, but embrace them as refining fires. The final test from God does not come to break us, it comes to reveal what is already within us. Throughout history, those who walked closest with God were tested most severely. Abraham was asked to sacrifice his beloved son, a test not of cruelty but of trust. Job, a man described as blameless, endured suffering so intense that his own friends assumed he must have sinned. Yet in the end he declared, "But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold." Job 23:10. These were not men abandoned by God, they were men being refined by him. The fire did not consume them, it revealed their faith. Gold must go through fire to be purified, and so must we. In Mere Christianity, Lewis explains, imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first perhaps you can understand what he is doing, but presently he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make sense. The suffering seems senseless until we realize he is not merely repairing us, he is transforming us into something greater than we imagine. Even Christ in his humanity was tested in the wilderness, Matthew 4:01, 11. 40 days of hunger, of silence, of temptations that sought to break him before his ministry began. The test was not for God to discover Christ's faithfulness, it was to demonstrate it. Likewise, our trials are not for God to learn about us, he already knows our hearts. They are for us to see ourselves as we truly are. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. 1 Corinthians 10:13. It is in the test that we recognize our strength, not in our own power, but in the power of God working within us. The mistake many make is assuming trials mean abandonment. But the silence of God does not mean his absence. In A Grief Observed, Lewis wrestles with this very question, writing, "Where is God? Go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is in vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face." Yet he came to understand that God's silence was not a rejection, but a call to deeper faith. The final test is not about passing or failing in human terms. It is about refinement. It is about becoming something stronger, purer, more like the one who endured the greatest test of all and emerged victorious. C.S. Lewis once wrote in the Screwtape Letters, "The more often he feels without acting, the less he will be able ever to act, and, in the long run, the less he will be able to feel." The final test from God is not about words, emotions, or even intellectual understanding. It is about what we truly believe when everything is on the line. When the test comes, it does not ask what we have said in the past, but what we will do in the present. In moments of hardship, the mask of mere religion falls away, and the truth of our faith is exposed. Many claim to trust God, yet when trials come, they falter. But real faith is not about what we say in comfort. It is what we do when there is no safety net. The Israelites, after witnessing countless miracles, stood at the edge of the promised land and still doubted, saying, "Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword?" Numbers 14 verse 3. Despite all they had seen, their final test revealed the reality of their hearts. When Christ spoke of the seed that fell on different kinds of soil, he was describing the way faith is tested. Some seed fell on rocky ground. It grew quickly but had no roots, so when trouble came it withered. Matthew 13:20-21. The final test reveals if we are deeply rooted or merely superficial. Those who only follow God when it is easy will not endure when it is hard. It is in the storm that we see whether we have built our house on sand or on rock. Matthew 7:24-27. Faith is not proven in knowledge but in action. In Mere Christianity, Lewis writes, "Do not waste time bothering whether you love your neighbor. Act as if you did." The same principle applies to faith. It is not enough to say we trust God. We must live as though we do. Abraham did not just say he had faith, he walked up the mountain with Isaac, knife in hand, Genesis 22:9-12. Peter did not just say he trusted Jesus, he stepped out of the boat onto the waves, Matthew 14:29. Their faith was not just belief, it was movement. When the final test comes, it is not about whether we understand everything, whether we feel strong, or even whether we are unafraid. It is about what we do. Faith is an act of the will, not merely a feeling in the heart. It is proven when everything around us tells us to turn back, but something inside us says, "Keep going." The test does not change God's plan, it reveals whether we will walk in it. As James 2:26 says, "Faith without works is dead." C.S. Lewis once wrote in The Weight of Glory, "At present we are on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door. We discern the freshness and purity of morning, but they do not make us fresh and pure. We cannot mingle with the splendors we see. The final test from God is not just about endurance, it is about transformation. It is not enough to survive the test, we must emerge changed by it. Trials are not merely obstacles, they are divine appointments, designed to reshape us into who we were meant to be. The Israelites wandered the desert for 40 years, not because God had abandoned them, but because he was shaping them. The Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart. Deuteronomy 8:02. The process was painful, but it was necessary. The land of promise could not be entered with a slave's mindset. The test was not about their ability to survive. It was about their ability to become the people God had called them to be. Many resist the refining fire, clinging to their old ways, but transformation requires surrender. In Mere Christianity, Lewis explains, "Give me all of you. I don't want so much of your time, so much of your talents and money, and so much of your work. I want you, all of you." The final test demands that we let go of the parts of ourselves that do not align with God's purpose. It is not just about enduring pain, but allowing that pain to reshape us. Even Christ, though perfect, underwent a form of transformation through suffering. Hebrews 5:8. 9 tells us, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. If the Son of God was shaped by suffering, how much more must we be? The transformation is often invisible in the moment. A seed buried underground does not look like it is growing, it looks like it is lost in the dark. But in time, what was hidden will break through the surface. Joseph spent years in a prison cell before he ruled Egypt. David was hunted in caves before he became king. Their tests were not detours from their destiny, they were the path to it. The question is not whether the test will come, but whether we will allow it to change us. Those who resist, who cling to what is comfortable, may survive, but they will remain the same. Those who surrender, who let the fire do its work, will come out on the other side as something new. As Romans 12:02 says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." The final test is not about getting through. It is about becoming. C.S. Lewis once wrote in Mere Christianity, "Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps, you can understand what he is doing, but presently he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and does not seem to make sense. What on earth is he up to?" The explanation is that he is building quite a different house from the one you thought of. The final test from God is not about maintaining the life we have, it is about preparing us for the life we were meant for. When God tests us, he does not simply ask for faith, he asks for surrender. And surrender is terrifying because it requires releasing control. Abraham had to surrender Isaac, not just physically but in his heart, trusting that God's plan was greater than his own understanding. Genesis 22:12. The Israelites had to surrender their fear of giants and trust that God would give them the promised land. Numbers 13:30. Even Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane faced the ultimate test, where his humanity cried out, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will but yours be done." Luke 22:42. The test of surrender is not just about obedience, it is about trust. Many resist surrender because they confuse it with defeat. But surrender to God is not losing, it is stepping into something greater. In The Problem of Pain, Lewis writes, "The human spirit will not even begin to try to surrender self-will as long as all seems to be well with it. Often, it is only through testing that we come to the end of ourselves and realize that God's way is better than our own." Surrender means letting go of our own plans, even when they seem good. Peter was tested when Jesus told him, "Where I am going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." John 13:36. He did not understand, and in his fear he resisted, but when he finally surrendered, he became the rock on which the church was built. The final test is not about whether we can hold on, it is about whether we can let go. There is a reason why gold must go through fire to be purified, because the fire burns away what does not belong. Surrender is painful because it feels like loss, but it is actually refinement. When Job lost everything, he did not know that his story would end in restoration. He only knew that in the midst of his suffering, he had one choice, to trust God or to turn away. And he chose trust. "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." Job 13:15. The test of surrender is not just about obedience. It is about whether we trust God enough to release what we are holding on to, believing that what he has for us is far greater than what we think we need. The final test is not just about passing, it is about laying everything down so that God can raise us up. C.S. Lewis once wrote in The Great Divorce, There are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, "Thy will be done." The final test from God is not about whether we understand everything. It is about whether we will trust Him even when we don't. Faith is not just believing in God's power, it is trusting His character, even when we cannot see the outcome. In every great test there is a moment of silence, a moment when God seems distant, when prayers seem unanswered, when the way forward is unclear. The Israelites stood at the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army closing in behind them. They saw no escape. But what did God say? "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Exodus 14:14. The silence of God is not abandonment. It is preparation. It is in the waiting that faith is either strengthened or lost. Many people mistake silence for absence. When Jesus was crucified, His disciples scattered in fear. They did not understand that in the silence of the tomb, God was working out the greatest victory in history. On the road to Emmaus, they said, "We had hoped that He was the one who was going to redeem Israel." Luke 24:21. They had lost faith because they could not see beyond the moment. But just because they could not see Jesus did not mean He was not there. He was walking beside them the entire time. Lewis reminds us in Mere Christianity, faith is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted, in spite of your changing moods. The final test is about whether we will hold on to what we once knew to be true when everything around us tells us otherwise. Job, in his suffering, could not hear God. His friends accused him, his body failed him, his wealth was gone, and yet, what did he say? "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end He will stand on the earth." Job 19:25. He trusted not because he saw, but because he believed. God's silence is often the moment before the breakthrough. Joseph sat in prison for years, falsely accused and forgotten, but in the silence, God was working. When the time was right, Joseph was raised up to a position of power that saved nations. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, and in that long night no voice came from heaven, but in the morning he stood unharmed, because God had been there all along. The final test is not about whether we always hear God, but whether we trust Him when we don't. It is easy to believe when we see miracles, when we feel His presence, when doors open before us, but true faith is tested in the silence, in the waiting, in the uncertainty. And it is those who trust in the silence who will one day hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Matthew 25:23. C.S. Lewis once wrote in the Screwtape Letters, "Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks around upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken and still obeys." The final test from God is not about how we feel, it is about what we choose. Faith is not an emotion, it is an act of the will. There will come a moment in every test when feelings fail, when the excitement of the journey wears off, when the promises seem distant, when doubt whispers that none of this matters. This is the moment of decision, not of feeling but of choice. When Jesus hung on the cross, He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In that moment, He felt the weight of separation, yet He still surrendered to the Father's will. He still surrendered to the Father's will. The final test demands that we obey, not because we feel strong, but because we have chosen to trust. Many expect faith to always feel powerful, always feel passionate, but true faith is revealed in the moments when passion fades and only the will remains. The Israelites were excited when they left Egypt, but when hunger and thirst came, they grumbled against God. They let their emotions drive them away from obedience. Joshua and Caleb, however, saw the same giants in the promised land and still chose to believe. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into that land. Numbers 14 verse 8. Their faith was not built on emotion, but on conviction. Lewis explains in Mere Christianity, faith is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods. Feelings are fleeting. They rise and fall with circumstances, but faith, real faith, is choosing to trust when nothing in you feels like it. Job had lost everything, his wealth, his children, even his health. His wife told him to curse God and die, but Job answered, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" Job 2:10. He refused to let his emotions define his obedience. Daniel could have avoided the lion's den by making one small compromise. He did not have to reject God, just pray in secret, just bow out of sight. But he chose obedience, not because it felt good, but because he knew what was right. And because of his choice, God shut the mouths of lions. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood before the furnace and declared, "The God we serve is able to deliver us, but even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods." Daniel 3:17-18. Even if he does not. Their obedience was not conditional on the outcome. It was a choice, no matter the cost. The final test is not about how strong we feel, but about whether we will stand firm even when everything in us wants to give up. It is not about feeling faith, it is about choosing faith. Those who pass the test are not those who always feel God, but those who obey him, even in the absence of feeling.